The ultimate form of betrayal is betraying oneself. The Empire of Varethia, a sprawling land of sun-drenched plains, snow-capped mountains, and bustling port cities, was a place where superstition clung to the air like the scent of jasmine on a warm summer night. And of all the superstitions that riddled the Varithian psyche, none was as potent, as deeply ingrained as the one surrounding twins. Twins, you see, were considered an omen, not your average everyday omen, like a black cat crossing your path or spilling your wine at a royal banquet. No, this was a full-blown, the gods are messing with us kind of omen. One twin was said to be blessed by the gods, destined for greatness, while the other was cursed, a harbinger of misfortune, a shadow clinging to the brilliance of their sibling. So, when Empress Aurelia gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl, the court was thrown into a tizzy that would make a flock of startled pigeons look like a synchronized ballet troupe. Priests were summoned, oracles consulted, and ancient texts dusted off and scrutinized for any clue as to which twin was the blessed one, and which was, well, let's just say, less fortunate. After much deliberation, accompanied by a truly impressive amount of incense burning and dramatic chanting, the priest declared Caius, the boy, to be the chosen one, the heir apparent, the future emperor of Varethia. Valerie, the girl, was deemed the shadow twin, a necessary but ultimately insignificant part of the cosmic equation. Now, you'd think this would create some serious sibling rivalry, a Cain and Abel situation with a side of who gets the bigger slice of cake drama, but Caius and Valerie, bless their little cotton socks, were having none of it. They were two halves of the same rebellious coin, a force of nature disguised as adorable toddlers. While Caius was paraded around the court, dressed in miniature versions of imperial robes and subjected to endless lessons on history, politics, and the art of looking regal while sitting on a ridiculously oversized throne, Valerie was relegated to the nursery, her existence largely ignored by everyone except her brother. But Valerie, unlike the court, was not about to be underestimated. She might have been the shadow twin, but she was also a Valerius, with the same fire in her blood, the same thirst for knowledge, the same stubborn refusal to be confined by the expectations of others. While Caius was learning about the glorious history of Varethia, Valerie was sneaking into the restricted section of the Imperial Library, devouring books on strategy, philosophy, and the art of war. While Caius was practicing his speeches, Valerie was eavesdropping on courtly gossip, learning the intricate web of alliances and betrayals that fueled the political machine. And while Caius was being taught the proper etiquette for royal banquets, Valerie was exploring the hidden passages of the palace, mapping its secret tunnels, and learning the art of silent movement and covert observation. She became a shadow in the truest sense of the word, a silent observer, a gatherer of secrets, a master of manipulation. She learned to read people, to anticipate their moves, to exploit their weaknesses. She learned to wield words like weapons, to weave webs of deceit with a smile and a whisper. And Caius, bless his trusting heart, never suspected a thing. He adored his sister, confided in her, shared his dreams, his fears, his ambitions. He saw her as his confidant, his ally, the one person he could trust in a world of sycophants and schemers. He never realized that Valerie, the shadow twin, was the one casting the shadows, the one pulling the strings, the one who would ultimately shape his destiny and the fate of the empire. Emperor Lucian IV, a man whose love for elaborate feasts and extravagant parties far surpassed his interest in matters of state, met his end not on a glorious battlefield or in a dramatic duel, but in the rather unglamorous setting of his own privy chamber. It wasn't exactly the heroic demise befitting an emperor, but hey, when you gotta go, right? The details were a bit hazy, and frankly, no one really wanted to dwell on them, but the general consensus was that a disgruntled noble, tired of the emperor's taxation without representation policy, mostly involving funding for increasingly ridiculous hat designs, had snuck into the palace with a particularly sharp dagger and a rather unfortunate lack of respect for royal digestive processes. The news of the emperor's demise hit the court like a rogue goose at a garden party. Suddenly, all those fancy hats and witty barbs seemed a tad less important when faced with the prospect of, a full-blown political crisis and the potential for a rather messy succession struggle. The court, a swirling vortex of silk, jewels, and backstabbing intrigue, erupted into a frenzy that would make a flock of startled pigeons look like a synchronized ballet troupe. Nobles scurried around like headless chickens, their voices a cacophony of panicked whispers and accusations. The emperor is dead. Long live... Uh, who exactly? It's a conspiracy! I always suspected the Duchess of Eldoria and her fondness for poisoned pastries. Nonsense. It was the royal gardener. He was always muttering about the emperor's lack of appreciation for his prize-winning roses. Amidst the chaos, Valeri, ever the calm in the storm, took charge. She might have been the shadow twin, but she was also the one with the brains, the cunning, and the sheer audacity to seize the moment. She found Caius, his face pale with shock and grief, and whispered in his ear, her voice a soothing balm amidst the chaos. Caius, you must act. You must claim the throne. Now. Caius, still reeling from the news of their father's demise, looked at her with uncertainty. But I'm not ready. You are ready, Valeri insisted, her eyes blazing with a fierce determination. You are the heir, the chosen one. You must step into your destiny. She guided him through the panicked court, her hand a steady presence on his arm, her voice a calming influence amidst the storm. She rallied the loyalists, silenced the dissenters, and orchestrated a swift and decisive coronation that left no room for doubt or challenge. Within hours, Caius was crowned Emperor of Verethia, his youthful face a mask of solemnity as he sat on the throne that had once been his father's, the weight of the empire settling on his shoulders. The court, still buzzing with the aftershocks of the assassination, bowed before their new emperor, their voices a chorus of forced congratulations and pledges of loyalty. But Valeri, watching from the shadows, knew that the true power lay not in the crown, but in the hands that guided it. She had orchestrated Caius's ascension, manipulated the court, and secured her own position as the power behind the throne. She was the shadow ruler, the unseen force that would shape the destiny of Verethia. And as she watched Caius, her brother, her emperor, her puppet, she couldn't help but smile. The game had begun, and she, the forgotten twin, the shadow in the background, was ready to play. Caius, bless his naive heart, was a puppet emperor in the truest sense of the word. He sat on the throne, his youthful face a mask of authority, his voice echoing through the grand halls of the palace, but the words he spoke, the decrees he signed, the decisions he made, they were all orchestrated by Valeri, the shadow puppeteer pulling the strings from behind the velvet curtains. She was a master of manipulation, a whisperer of suggestions, a weaver of subtle influence that wrapped around Caius's mind like a silken web. She knew his strengths, his weaknesses, his deepest desires, and his hidden insecurities. She knew how to play on his emotions, how to guide his thoughts, how to shape his actions to align with her own agenda. Caius, my dear brother, she'd say, her voice a gentle caress, her eyes filled with sisterly concern. Perhaps it would be wise to reconsider that trade agreement with the Kingdom of Eldoria. Their ambassador, you see, has a rather unfortunate reputation for dishonesty. Or, Caius, my love, I overheard some rather disturbing rumors about Lord Valerius's loyalty. Perhaps it would be prudent to keep a closer eye on his activities. Caius, trusting and easily swayed, would nod in agreement, his brow furrowed with concern, his voice echoing Valeri's suggestions as he addressed the court. He never suspected that the doubts, the suspicions, the very ideas that shaped his decisions were planted there by his own sister, the shadow ruler who held his reign in her hands. Valeri didn't limit her influence to Caius. She moved through the court like a phantom, her presence barely noticed, her words carrying the weight of unseen authority. She cultivated alliances with key nobles, whispering secrets in their ears, offering favors, playing on their ambitions and fears to secure their loyalty. She exposed conspiracies, thwarted rebellions, and neutralized threats to her brother's rule with a ruthlessness that surprised even the most seasoned courtiers. She was a master strategist, a cunning tactician, her mind a battlefield where she outmaneuvered her opponents with a chilling efficiency. She built a network of spies and informants, their eyes and ears spread throughout the empire, their whispers feeding her a constant stream of information. She knew the movements of armies, the secrets of diplomats, the hidden desires of the most powerful nobles. She was the spider at the center of the web, her threads of influence reaching into every corner of the empire. And as her power grew, so did her confidence. She was no longer the timid girl, the shadow twin hidden in the background. She was Valeri Valerius, the power behind the throne, the unseen ruler of Varethia. And she would not rest until she had secured her position, eliminated her enemies, and shaped the empire in her own image. While Valeri was busy playing puppet master with Caius and the court, trouble was brewing on the outskirts of the empire. It wasn't the usual kind of trouble, like a border skirmish with some grumpy neighbors or a peasant revolt over the price of turnips. No, this was a different beast altogether. A shadowy, insidious threat that whispered on the wind and crept through the back alleys of the capital. It was the whisper of rebellion, the murmur of discontent, the growing unrest that stemmed from a name long forgotten, a name that had been banished to the dusty corners of the imperial archives. Prince Magnus. Magnus, you see, was the emperor's eldest son, born out of wedlock, a love child conceived during Lucian IV's wilder days, before he'd settled down with Empress Aurelia and embraced the joys of fatherhood. And, let's be honest, mostly the joys of avoiding fatherhood responsibilities. Now, you'd think being the firstborn son would guarantee a comfy spot in the line of succession, maybe a fancy title and a nice estate with a vineyard and a flock of peacocks. But Varethia, with its obsession with omens and superstitions, wasn't exactly known for its progressive views on family matters. A bastard son, even one with impeccable lineage, was considered a stain on the imperial bloodline, a threat to the delicate balance of power. So, poor little Magnus was shipped off to some remote corner of the empire, his existence conveniently forgotten by the court, his name whispered only in hushed tones and accompanied by disapproving headshakes. But Magnus, bless his rebellious spirit, wasn't about to let a little thing like exile dampen his ambitions. He grew up in the shadows, hardened by hardship, fueled by a burning resentment for the family that had cast him aside. He gathered followers, disgruntled nobles, ambitious mercenaries, and those who saw in him a chance to disrupt the status quo, to challenge the established order. He built a secret army, trained in the harsh conditions of the borderlands, their loyalty forged in the fires of shared ambition and a thirst for revenge. They were a force to be reckoned with, a hidden threat that lurked in the shadows, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. And with the emperor's assassination, that moment had arrived. The whispers of rebellion grew louder, spreading through the taverns and marketplaces, carried by travelers and merchants, their words painting a picture of a forgotten prince, a rightful heir, a savior who would restore justice and order to the empire. Valeri, her network of spies and informants working overtime, caught wind of the growing unrest. She knew that Magnus was not just a disgruntled exile, but a serious threat, a rival who could challenge Caius's rule and jeopardize her own carefully constructed power base. She began to prepare, her mind a whirlwind of strategic calculations, her eyes scanning maps and reports, her fingers tracing the lines of potential battlefields. She knew that a war was coming, a war that would pit brother against brother, a war that would test her cunning, her strength, and her loyalty to the brother she controlled, the brother who was slowly slipping away from her grasp. Lady Viviana Corvius was a creature of exquisite beauty and ruthless ambition, a viper wrapped in silk and adorned with jewels. She moved through the court with the grace of a panther and the cunning of a fox, her eyes a mesmerizing blend of emerald green and calculating gold. She had arrived in the capital shortly after Caius's coronation, ostensibly to offer her condolences and pledge her loyalty to the new emperor. But Valeri, with her finely honed instincts for deceit, recognized the hunger in Viviana's gaze, the ambition that simmered beneath her polished facade. Viviana set her sights on Caius, the young, inexperienced emperor, easily swayed by flattery and susceptible to feminine charms. She wove a web of seduction, her laughter echoing through the palace halls, her touch a delicate caress that ignited a fire in Caius's heart. She played on his insecurities, his doubts, his yearning for validation. She praised his every decision, inflated his ego, and whispered suggestions in his ear, her voice a silken poison that slowly seeped into his mind. "Your sister Valeri is a remarkable woman, of course," she'd murmur, her voice laced with a subtle undercurrent of concern. "But her influence Um, it is, uh, considerable, is it not? The court whispers, my emperor, about her power, her control. They fear she overshadows you, that she holds the true reins of power. Sir, sabatu. Caius, his confidence still fragile, his grasp on power tenuous, found himself drawn to Viviana's words, her subtle insinuations planting seeds of doubt in his mind. He had always trusted Valeri, relied on her guidance, but Viviana's whispers, like a persistent drizzle, slowly eroded the foundation of their bond. He began to question Valeri's motives, to see her actions in a new light. Her advice, once welcomed, now seemed like manipulation. Her influence, once a source of strength, now felt like a constraint. Viviana, sensing his growing unease, fueled his doubts, her words a subtle poison that twisted his perception, turning his love for his sister into suspicion, his trust into fear. She means well, I'm sure, she'd say, her eyes wide with feigned innocence. But power, it can be intoxicating, can it not? It can change people, even those we love most. Caius, his mind clouded by Viviana's manipulations, his heart torn between loyalty and suspicion, found himself drifting away from Valeri, his gaze drawn to the alluring Lady Viviana, her beauty a siren song, her whispers a venomous symphony that slowly poisoned his soul. Valeri, watching from the shadows, saw the change in Caius, the growing distance in his eyes, the suspicion that crept into his voice. She recognized Viviana's influence, the subtle poison she had injected into her brother's mind. And as she watched the web of deceit tighten around Caius, she felt a cold anger rise within her, a fury directed not just at Viviana, but at herself. Had she created a monster, a puppet emperor who was now turning against his own puppeteer? Had her ambition, her desire for power, blinded her to the dangers lurking in her own court, in the heart of her own brother? The game had taken a dangerous turn, and Valeri, the master player, found herself facing a new challenge, a challenge that threatened not just her power, but the very foundation of her relationship with the brother she had once loved, the brother she had raised to the throne, the brother who was now becoming her enemy. General Murdoch Veros was a man of unwavering loyalty and formidable strength. A seasoned warrior whose reputation on the battlefield was matched only by his integrity in the court. He had served the Valerius dynasty for decades, his loyalty forged in the fires of countless battles fought in the name of the empire. He had witnessed the rise and fall of emperors, the shifting tides of power, the treacherous currents of courtly intrigue. He had seen the darkness in the hearts of men, the ambition that could corrupt even the most noble souls. But through it all, he had remained steadfast, his loyalty unwavering, his gaze fixed on the true heart of the empire, the Valerius twins, Caius and Valeri. He had watched them grow, witnessed their unique bond, their complementary strengths, their shared ambition. He had seen the spark of greatness in Caius, the fire of leadership that burned within him. But he had also seen the true power, the cunning intellect, the ruthless determination that resided in Valeri, the shadow twin, the hidden force that shaped the destiny of the empire. He had pledged his loyalty to both, but his heart belonged to Valeri. He saw in her the true ruler, the one who wielded power not with a crown, but with a whisper, a glance, a subtle manipulation that could topple empires without a single drop of blood being spilled. He watched with growing concern as Caius fell under Viviana's spell, his paranoia festering, his trust in Valeri eroding. He saw the poison in Viviana's words, the subtle manipulations that twisted Caius's perception, turning his love for his sister into suspicion, his reliance on her guidance into resentment. Murdoch tried to warn Caius, to open his eyes to the danger lurking in his own court, in the arms of the woman who whispered sweet lies in his ear. But Caius, blinded by Viviana's charms, deafened by his own insecurities, refused to listen. "You misunderstand, Murdoch," he'd say, his voice laced with a chilling arrogance. "Viviana is my confidant, my advisor. She sees the threats that you, in your blind loyalty to Valeri, failed to recognize." Murdoch, his heart heavy with a sense of foreboding, watched as Caius drifted further away from Valeri, his decisions becoming increasingly erratic, his actions fueled by paranoia and suspicion. He saw the empire teetering on the brink of chaos, its foundations weakened by the emperor's growing instability, its future threatened by the whispers of rebellion and the machinations of a power-hungry noblewoman. He knew he had to act to protect the empire, to safeguard the legacy of the Valerius twins, even if it meant defying his emperor, even if it meant sacrificing his own position, his own safety. He sought out Valeri, his face etched with worry, his voice grave. "Your brother is lost, Valeri," he said, his words a heavy weight in the silent chamber. "He is blinded by Viviana's influence, deaf to the whispers of reason. He is no longer the emperor we crowned, the leader we trusted." Valeri, her own heart heavy with a mixture of grief and anger, nodded in agreement. She had seen the change in Caius, the growing darkness that threatened to consume him. But what could they do? How could they save him from himself, from the woman who held him captive? Murdoch, his gaze unwavering, his voice firm, offered a solution, a dangerous path that could lead to salvation or destruction. "We must act, Valeri," he said, his words a call to action. "We must protect the empire, even if it means removing Caius from power." Murdoch's plan was audacious, bordering on treasonous. He proposed to discreetly rally the support of key nobles, those who still valued the stability of the empire, those who saw the danger in Caius's growing paranoia and Viviana's manipulative influence. Together they would confront Caius, force him to relinquish power, and install a regency council until he was deemed fit to rule again. Valeri, torn between her loyalty to her brother and her duty to the empire, hesitated. Could she truly betray Caius, the brother she had raised to the throne, the brother she had always protected? But then she remembered the coldness in his eyes, the suspicion in his voice, the way he had dismissed her counsel, her warnings, her love. She agreed to Murdoch's plan, her heart heavy with a sense of foreboding. She knew the risks, the potential consequences, but she also knew that inaction could lead to even greater disaster, to the collapse of the empire, to the destruction of everything she had worked so hard to achieve. They moved in secrecy, their whispers echoing in the shadowed corridors of the palace, their meetings cloaked in the darkness of night. They gathered their allies, their numbers growing, their resolve strengthening with each passing day. But Viviana, ever vigilant, ever cunning, had her own spies, her own informants. She discovered their plot, their plans, their secret meetings. And she saw in it an opportunity, a chance to eliminate her rivals, to consolidate her own power, to secure her position as the true ruler of Varithia. She whispered in Caius's ear, her voice a venomous caress, her words painting a picture of betrayal, of treachery, of a conspiracy against his throne, his authority, his very life. "Murdoch plots against you, my emperor," she hissed, her eyes gleaming with a malicious triumph. "He seeks to usurp your power, to steal your crown, to cast you aside like a broken toy." Caius, his paranoia now a raging fire, his trust in Valeri completely shattered, believed her. He ordered Murdoch's arrest, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. Murdoch, betrayed by his own loyalty, was dragged before Caius, his face etched with a stoic acceptance of his fate. He denied the accusations, proclaimed his innocence, but his words fell on deaf ears. Caius, consumed by Viviana's poison, saw only a traitor, a conspirator, a threat to his fragile grasp on power. He sentenced Murdoch to death, his voice devoid of emotion, his eyes cold and unforgiving. The execution was swift, brutal, a public spectacle designed to intimidate any who dared to challenge the emperor's authority. Valeri, watching from the shadows, her heart breaking with grief and rage, felt the last vestiges of her trust in Caius crumble away. He had become a monster, a puppet dancing to the tune of a manipulative woman, a tyrant who had sacrificed his most loyal friend, his most trusted advisor, on the altar of his own paranoia. She mourned Murdoch, his death a heavy weight on her soul, a constant reminder of the price of loyalty, the cost of power. But she also knew that his sacrifice had not been in vain. It had exposed the true nature of Caius, the extent of Viviana's influence, the fragility of the empire she had worked so hard to build. And as she watched the flames of rebellion flicker on the horizon, as she felt the ground shift beneath her feet, she knew that she had to make a choice that would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of Varithia. Murdoch's execution was the spark that ignited the powder keg. The whispers of rebellion, once hushed and hesitant, now roared through the empire like a wildfire, fueled by outrage at Caius's tyranny and a growing belief in Magnus, the exiled prince, the forgotten heir, the man who promised to restore order and justice to Varethia. Valeri, her grief for Murdoch, a cold, hard knot in her chest, her trust in Caius shattered beyond repair, knew that war was inevitable. It was no longer a question of if, but when, and she would be ready. She retreated into the shadows, her mind a whirlwind of strategic calculations, her eyes scanning maps and reports, her fingers tracing the lines of potential battlefields. She was a master strategist, a cunning tactician, her mind a battlefield where she outmaneuvered her opponents before a single sword was drawn. She knew that Magnus, driven by ambition and a thirst for revenge, would be a formidable opponent. He had built a loyal army, trained in the harsh conditions of the borderlands, their loyalty forged in the fires of shared hardship and a common enemy. He had the support of disgruntled nobles, those who saw in him a chance to seize power, to challenge the established order. But Valeri had advantages of her own. She controlled the flow of information, her network of spies and informants providing her with a constant stream of intelligence. She knew Magnus's movements, his strengths, his weaknesses. She knew the terrain, the strategic points, the hidden paths that could turn the tide of battle. She began to consolidate her forces, recalling loyal troops from the borders, bolstering the palace guard, recruiting mercenaries from the far reaches of the empire. She handpicked her generals, men of unwavering loyalty, men who understood her vision, men who would follow her without question. She studied Magnus's tactics, his strategies, his past battles. She analyzed his strengths, his weaknesses, his tendencies. She learned his patterns, his rhythms, his tells. She knew how he thought, how he moved, how he would react to any given situation, and she prepared her own traps, her own strategies, her own plans. She would not fight Magnus on his terms. She would dictate the battlefield, control the flow of the war, and manipulate him into making the mistakes she needed him to make. She used her influence over Caius, still clinging to the illusion of power, to issue decrees that would benefit her own war efforts. She subtly redirected resources, shifted troop deployments, and secured key alliances with neighboring kingdoms, all under the guise of strengthening the empire's defenses against the impending rebellion. She spread misinformation, sowing seeds of doubt and distrust among Magnus's followers, playing on their ambitions, their insecurities, their fears. She turned allies into rivals, loyalists into traitors, weakening his forces from within. She knew that this war would be brutal, a clash of brothers, a battle for the throne, a fight for survival. But she was ready. She had been preparing for this moment since she was a child, learning the game of power, mastering the art of manipulation, honing her skills in the shadows. She was no longer the timid girl, the shadow twin, hidden in the background. She was Valeri Valerius, the power behind the throne, the architect of her own destiny, the woman who would shape the fate of Varethia. And as the storm clouds gathered on the horizon, as the whispers of rebellion grew into a deafening roar, she stood firm, her gaze fixed on the future, her resolve unwavering. She would not just win this war. She would dominate it. She would control it. She would use it to solidify her power, to crush her enemies, to secure her place as the true ruler of the empire. The war drums thundered, a relentless beat that echoed through the palace halls, a constant reminder of the impending clash, the brother against brother showdown that would determine the fate of Varethia. Valeri, her war room, a symphony of maps, reports, and whispered strategies, stood at the precipice of a choice, a crossroads where loyalty and ambition waged a silent battle. On one hand, there was Caius, her twin, her emperor, the brother she had raised to the throne, the puppet she had manipulated, the man who had become a stranger, his heart poisoned by paranoia, his mind twisted by Viviana's venomous whispers. Could she truly abandon him, cast him aside like a broken toy, after everything they had been through, after everything she had done to protect him, to secure his power? On the other hand, there was the Empire, the sprawling land of Varethia, its people caught in the crossfire of a power struggle, its future hanging in the balance. Could she stand by and watch as Caius, driven by his own delusions, plunged the empire into chaos, his reign a reign of terror fueled by suspicion and fear? And then there was Valeri herself, the shadow twin, the hidden power, the woman who had always craved recognition, who had yearned for the throne that had been denied to her since birth. Was this her chance, her opportunity to step out of the shadows, to claim her rightful place, to rule Varethia not as a puppet master, but as its queen? The conflict raged within her, a tempest of emotions, a clash of loyalties, a battle between the woman she had been and the woman she had become. She paced the war room, her footsteps echoing in the tense silence, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts, her heart a battlefield where love and ambition clashed in a deadly duel. She thought of Murdoch, his loyalty, his sacrifice, his final words of forgiveness. She thought of Magnus, his ambition, his thirst for revenge, his claim to the throne. She thought of the Empire, its people, its future, its destiny. And finally, she made her choice. She would not abandon Caius. She would not let him destroy himself, destroy the Empire. She would save him, even if it meant sacrificing her own ambitions, even if it meant defying his will, even if it meant seizing control from the shadows. But she would also not let Magnus win. She would not let him claim the throne, plunge Varethia into further chaos. She would fight him, defeat him, and secure her own position as the true power behind the throne, the unseen ruler who shaped the destiny of the Empire. She was Valeri Valerius, the Shadow Twin, the master manipulator, the woman who had always played the game from the sidelines. But now the game had changed. The stakes were higher, and she was ready to step into the spotlight, to claim her rightful place, to rule Varethia not as a queen, but as the power behind the crown, the force that would guide the Empire towards a new era of prosperity and stability. The whispers turned to shouts, the murmurs to battle cries. Magnus, the exiled prince, the forgotten heir, the man who had lived in the shadows for so long, emerged with the force of a tempest, his army a whirlwind of steel and fury sweeping across Varethia. He had timed his rebellion perfectly, capitalizing on the unrest that simmered beneath the surface of Caius's fragile rule. The nobles, disillusioned with the emperor's paranoia and Viviana's manipulative influence, flocked to Magnus's banner, their oaths of loyalty shifting with the changing winds of power. "For Prince Magnus!" they roared, their voices echoing across the battlefields, their swords clashing against the imperial forces, their determination fueled by a belief in their cause, the promise of a new era, a return to stability and justice. Magnus, a charismatic leader forged in the fires of exile, inspired his troops, his speeches a blend of fiery rhetoric and genuine concern for the plight of the common folk. He promised to restore order, to end corruption, to bring prosperity to the Empire. And the people, weary of Caius's erratic rule, listened, their hearts filled with hope, their hands reaching for the weapons of rebellion. "He speaks of justice, of fairness," they whispered in the marketplaces, their voices a chorus of discontent. "He promises to restore the Empire to its former glory." Magnus's army swept through the outer provinces, their victories swift and decisive. City after city fell, their gates flung open in welcome, their citizens cheering the arrival of their supposed savior. The imperial forces, demoralized and poorly led, offered little resistance, their ranks riddled with doubt and divided loyalties. News of Magnus's advance reached the capital, carried by panicked messengers, their words painting a grim picture of a collapsing empire, a throne teetering on the brink of destruction. The court, once a haven of opulent complacency, was now a scene of chaos and fear. "He's coming!" shrieked Lady Alara, her voice a shrill echo in the grand hall. "Magnus is coming to take the throne!" "We're doomed," wailed Lord Valerius, his face pale, his hands trembling. "He'll have our heads." Caius, his paranoia now a full-blown panic attack, paced the throne room like a caged lion, his eyes darting nervously, his voice a mixture of bluster and fear. "Silence!" he roared, his voice cracking with a desperate attempt to assert his authority. "We will defend the capital. We will crush this rebellion." But even as he spoke, his words lacked conviction. He knew deep down that his reign was crumbling, his power slipping away like sand through his fingers. He had alienated his allies, ignored his advisors, and trusted the wrong people. And now he was paying the price. Valeri, watching the chaos unfold with a detached amusement, couldn't help but feel a flicker of satisfaction. Caius's downfall, though painful to witness, was also a validation of her own judgment, her own foresight. She had warned him, tried to guide him, but he had refused to listen, and now he was reaping the consequences of his own folly. But she also knew that Magnus's victory was not a desirable outcome. He was a threat, a rival, a man driven by ambition and a thirst for revenge. His rule, though promising on the surface, would likely be just as tyrannical as Caius's, perhaps even more so. She had to act, to intervene, to shape the course of events to her own advantage. She had to play the game, manipulate the players, and ensure that the final outcome, no matter how chaotic the path, served her own purpose, her own ambition, her own vision for the future of Varethia. Valeri had always known Viviana was ambitious, a climber eager to latch onto power. But as the rebellion raged and whispers of Viviana's own lineage surfaced, a darker truth emerged. Viviana wasn't just some power-hungry noblewoman. She was a distant relative of the Valerius dynasty, her claim to the throne even more legitimate than Magnus's. Suddenly, Viviana's seduction of Caius, her whispers of paranoia, her fueling of his insecurities, took on a sinister new meaning. She wasn't just manipulating Caius, she was grooming him for disposal. Once Magnus was defeated, she would expose Caius's instability, paint herself as a savior, and seize the throne for herself. The realization hit Valerie like a thunderbolt. She had been so focused on the external threat, on Magnus and his rebellion, that she had overlooked the viper nesting in her own bosom. Fury, cold and sharp, coursed through her veins. Viviana had used her, manipulated her, played her like a pawn in her own twisted game. Valeri, however, was not one to be outmaneuvered. She had learned from the best, honed her skills in the crucible of courtly intrigue. She would play Viviana's game, but she would play it better, with a ruthlessness that would make the Lady Viviana tremble. She began to gather evidence, her spies discreetly observing Viviana's every move, her informants whispering secrets in her ear. She uncovered Viviana's clandestine meetings with disgruntled nobles, intercepted her coded messages to Magnus, and discovered her hidden stash of documents proving her lineage, her claim to the throne. With the evidence in hand, Valeri decided it was time for a confrontation, a final showdown with the woman who had dared to challenge her, to manipulate her, to threaten her vision for the empire. She found Viviana in her chambers, surrounded by luxurious silks and fragrant oils, her beauty a mask that hid the venomous ambition within. "Lady Viviana," Valerie said, her voice deceptively calm, her eyes gleaming with a chilling intensity, "we need to talk." So, Viviana, her smile faltering for a fleeting moment, gestured towards a plush chaise lounge. "Of course, dear Valeri. What brings you to my humble abode?" "Oh, just a few concerns," Valerie replied, her lips curving into a predatory smile. "Concerns about your loyalty, your ambitions, your lineage?" Viviana's composure finally cracked, her eyes widening with a flicker of fear. "I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her voice laced with a nervous tremor. "Oh, I think you do," Valerie countered, her voice hardening. "I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. You've been playing a dangerous game, Viviana, a game that could cost you everything." She laid out the evidence, the intercepted messages, the secret documents, the testimonies of witnesses who had seen Viviana's treachery firsthand. Viviana, her face pale, her eyes darting nervously, tried to deny, to deflect, to weave her usual web of deceit. But Valerie, armed with the truth, was impervious to her manipulations. "It's over, Viviana," Valerie declared, her voice ringing with finality. "Your game is exposed, your ambitions laid bare. You have betrayed the Empire, betrayed Caius, betrayed me. And for that, you will pay the price." Viviana, her facade finally crumbling, her desperation rising, lunged at Valeri, a jeweled dagger gleaming in her hand. But Valerie, anticipating the move, was quicker. She disarmed Viviana with a swift motion, her own dagger pressing against the noblewoman's throat. "Don't make this any worse than it already is," Valerie warned, her voice a chilling whisper. Viviana, defeated, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hatred, slumped back against the chaise lounge, her body trembling, her dreams of power shattered. Valeri, her gaze unwavering, her resolve hardened, made her decision. She would not kill Viviana. Not yet. She had a different fate in mind, a punishment that would be far more fitting, far more devastating for a woman who valued power and prestige above all else. You will leave the capital tonight, Valerie declared, her voice cold and sharp. You will return to your estates, stripped of your titles, your influence, your wealth. You will live out your days in obscurity, a forgotten shadow, a cautionary tale whispered in the corridors of power. Viviana, her pride wounded, her ambition crushed, could only nod in silent agreement. She had played the game and lost, and now she was paying the price. Valerie watched as Viviana was escorted from the palace, her head bowed in shame, her dreams of power turned to ashes. She had eliminated a threat, neutralized a rival, and secured her own position. But as she looked out at the storm raging outside, the storm that threatened to engulf the empire, she knew that the battle was far from over. She had won a skirmish, but the war for the throne, the war for the future of Verethia had just begun. The final battle unfolded on the windswept plains outside the capital, a clash of steel and fury that painted the landscape in hues of blood and fire. Magnus, at the head of his rebel army, his armor gleaming in the pale sunlight, exuded an aura of confidence, his eyes burning with a righteous zeal that inspired his troops. Valerie, observing from a strategic vantage point atop a hill, her war map spread before her, felt a thrill of anticipation. She had anticipated this confrontation, planned for it, manipulated events to ensure it unfolded on her terms. Magnus, for all his bluster and bravado, was walking into a carefully laid trap. The initial clash was a chaotic symphony of screams, clashing steel, and the thunder of hooves. Magnus's forces, fueled by their early victories and their belief in their leader, charged with a ferocity that threatened to overwhelm the imperial lines. But Valerie, anticipating this tactic, had positioned her reserve troops strategically, their sudden appearance disrupting the rebel advance, turning the tide of the battle. She had studied Magnus's tactics, his strategies, his patterns. She knew his strengths, his weaknesses, his tendencies, and she exploited them ruthlessly. She feigned retreats, lured his troops into ambushes, and used the terrain to her advantage, turning the battlefield into a deadly maze where her enemies were constantly disoriented and outmaneuvered. She unleashed her secret weapon, a squadron of archers trained in the art of guerrilla warfare, their arrows raining down on the rebel ranks, their precision targeting key figures, disrupting communication, and sowing chaos among the enemy. Magnus, realizing he was being outmaneuvered, his initial confidence waning, attempted to rally his troops, his voice booming across the battlefield, his sword a beacon of defiance. But Valerie, anticipating this move, had planted her own agents among his ranks, their whispers of doubt and dissent eroding his authority, undermining his leadership. The battle raged for hours, a brutal dance of death and destruction. But Valerie's strategic brilliance, her cunning manipulations, and her ruthless execution of her plans slowly turned the tide in her favor. Magnus's forces, once a formidable threat, now faltered, their ranks thinning, their morale crumbling. Valerie, sensing the shift in momentum, ordered a final decisive charge, her cavalry thundering across the plains, their swords gleaming in the afternoon sun, their cries of victory echoing across the battlefield. Magnus, surrounded by his dwindling guard, his armor dented and bloodied, his face etched with a mixture of fury and despair, fought with the courage of a cornered lion. But it was a losing battle, a desperate stand against an overwhelming force. He was captured, disarmed, and dragged before Valerie, his eyes burning with a defiant hatred that mirrored her own. "You have lost, Magnus," Valerie declared, her voice ringing with authority, her gaze unwavering. "Your rebellion is crushed, your ambitions thwarted. The throne is not yours to take." Magnus, his pride wounded, his dreams shattered, spat at her feet. "You are a traitor, Valerie!" he snarled, his voice laced with venom. "You have betrayed your brother, your family, your empire." "I have protected the empire," Valerie countered, her voice cold and sharp. "I have saved it from the clutches of a tyrant, a madman who would have destroyed it with his paranoia and his weakness." She turned away, her gaze sweeping across the battlefield, the scene of her victory, the price of her ambition. "Take him away," she ordered her guards, her voice devoid of emotion. "He will be imprisoned. And then we will decide his fate." As Magnus was led away, his curses echoing across the battlefield. Valeri felt a pang of regret, a flicker of sympathy for the brother she had defeated, the brother who had been denied his birthright, the brother who had become a victim of his own ambition and the machinations of others. But she pushed those feelings aside. She had made her choice, chosen the empire over family, power over sentiment. And she would not let regret or any other emotion weaken her resolve, cloud her judgment, or jeopardize her vision for the future of Varethia. Meanwhile, back in the capital, news of Viviana's downfall and Magnus's capture reached Caius, his paranoia now a raging inferno, his mind a twisted labyrinth of suspicion and fear. He raged against Valeri, accusing her of treachery, of plotting against him, of usurping his power. "She has taken everything from me!" he screamed, his voice echoing through the empty halls of the palace. "My love, my throne, my empire. She will pay for this betrayal." He summoned his remaining loyalists, a dwindling band of sycophants and opportunists, and plotted his revenge, his eyes burning with a dangerous madness, his heart filled with a venomous hatred for the sister who had dared to defy him, to control him, to outmaneuver him. The storm had passed, but the skies were still dark, the air heavy with a sense of foreboding. The battle for the throne was over, but the war for the soul of Varethia, the war between the twins, the war between Valeri and Caius, had just begun. Caius, consumed by paranoia and fueled by Viviana's venomous whispers, even in her absence, saw enemies lurking in every shadow, treachery in every smile. He trusted no one, not even his own shadow, which he suspected of plotting to overthrow him and establish a shadow government. Okay, maybe not that last part, but you get the idea. He decided to strike first, to eliminate the threat that Valeri posed, to reclaim the power he believed she had stolen from him. He gathered his remaining loyalists, a motley crew of ambitious nobles, disgruntled military officers, and a surprisingly large number of people who seemed to be mainly interested in free food and wine. His plan, hatched in the secrecy of his chambers, fueled by sleepless nights and copious amounts of fortified wine, was audacious, bordering on insane. He would lure Valeri to a private meeting, accuse her of treason, and then, with the help of his loyalists, seize her and imprison her. He would then declare himself the true ruler of Varethia, free from her manipulative influence, his power absolute and unchallenged. He sent a message to Valeri, his voice dripping with false affection, his words a carefully crafted web of deceit. "My dearest sister," he wrote, "I yearn to reconcile with you, to mend the rift that has divided us. I implore you to meet me in the Grand Library, where we can discuss our differences and forge a new path forward together." Valeri, receiving the message, couldn't help but scoff. Caius, the master of subtlety, had truly outdone himself this time. She recognized the trap for what it was, the desperation in his words, the thinly veiled threat that lurked beneath the surface. But she also saw an opportunity, a chance to end this charade once and for all, to secure her position, to eliminate the threat that Caius posed, not just to her but to the empire itself. She accepted his invitation, her reply a masterpiece of polite deception, her words laced with a subtle mockery that only she and Caius would understand. "My beloved brother," she wrote, "I am overjoyed by your desire for reconciliation. I shall meet you in the Grand Library, eager to mend our bond and forge a new future for Varethia." She arrived at the library, accompanied by her loyal guards, their presence a silent warning, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords. Caius was already there, his face pale, his eyes darting nervously, his loyalists clustered around him like a pack of wolves sensing a kill. "Valeri," he said, his voice strained, his attempt at a welcoming smile faltering. "Thank you for coming." "Of course, Caius," she replied, her voice calm and steady, her gaze unwavering. "I am always eager to mend fences, sir." He launched into a rambling speech, his words a mixture of accusations, justifications, and thinly veiled threats. He accused her of manipulating him, of controlling him, of stealing his power. He blamed her for the rebellion, for the war, for the unrest that plagued the empire. Valeri listened patiently, her face a mask of polite indifference, her mind working furiously. She knew that this was not a negotiation, not a reconciliation. This was a power play, a desperate attempt by a cornered man to reclaim his throne, his authority, his pride. And she would not let him succeed. When Caius finally finished his tirade, his voice hoarse, his breath coming in ragged gasps, Valerie spoke, her voice cutting through the tense silence, her words sharp as daggers. "You are delusional, Caius," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "You have been consumed by your own paranoia, blinded by your own fear. You are no longer fit to rule, no longer capable of leading this empire." Caius, his face contorted with rage, his eyes blazing with a dangerous madness, drew his sword, its blade gleaming in the dim light of the library. "You will not take my throne from me!" he screamed, his voice echoing through the vast chamber. "I am the emperor. I will not be controlled by you, by anyone." His loyalists, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, drew their own weapons, their faces grim, their eyes fixed on Valerie and her guards. A tense standoff ensued, the air thick with anticipation, the silence punctuated only by the ragged breathing of the conspirators and the soft clinking of steel. But Valerie, ever the master strategist, had anticipated this move. She had her own loyalists positioned throughout the library, their presence hidden, their weapons ready, and with a subtle signal, a barely perceptible nod, she unleashed them. The library erupted in chaos, a whirlwind of clashing steel, shouts, and the thud of bodies hitting the floor. Caius's loyalists, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, were quickly subdued, their rebellion crushed before it could truly begin. Caius, his face pale with shock and disbelief, his sword clattering to the floor, stared at Valerie, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hatred. You have betrayed me," he stammered, his voice trembling. "I have saved the Empire from you," Valerie countered, her voice cold and hard. "You are no longer a threat, Caius. You are no longer an emperor. You are nothing." She ordered his imprisonment, his confinement to his own chambers, a gilded cage where he would live out his days, a puppet ruler stripped of his power, a shadow of his former self. And as she walked away from the library, the scene of his downfall, the echo of his defeat ringing in her ears, Valerie felt a pang of sadness, a flicker of regret for the brother she had once loved, the brother she had sacrificed for the sake of the empire, the brother who had become a victim of his own paranoia and the machinations of others. But she pushed those feelings aside. She had made her choice, chosen power over sentiment, duty over love, and she would not let regret or any other emotion weaken her resolve, cloud her judgment, or jeopardize her vision for the future of Verethia. With Caius confined to his gilded cage, a puppet emperor stripped of his power, Valerie's control over Verethia was absolute. She ruled from the shadows, her influence permeating every aspect of the empire, her will shaping the destiny of its people. She was the unseen hand that guided the court, the whisper in the ear of every noble, the fear in the heart of every conspirator. She controlled the flow of information, the movement of armies, the decisions of the council. She was the spider at the center of the web, her threads of influence reaching into every corner of the empire. She reformed the court, purging it of the corrupt and the incompetent, replacing them with loyalists, with those who understood her vision, who respected her authority, who feared her wrath. She streamlined the bureaucracy, eliminated unnecessary layers of administration, and made the wheels of government turn with a newfound efficiency. She invested in infrastructure, building roads and bridges, improving trade routes, and fostering economic growth. She reformed the tax system, making it fairer for the common folk, ensuring that the wealth of the empire flowed not just to the coffers of the nobles, but to the pockets of the people who worked the land, who built the cities, who defended the borders. She strengthened the military, expanding its ranks, improving its training, and equipping it with the latest weapons and armor. She appointed skilled generals, men and women of proven loyalty and strategic brilliance, who led the imperial forces to victory against external threats and internal rebellions. She fostered a culture of learning, investing in schools and libraries, promoting the arts and sciences, and encouraging the exchange of knowledge and ideas. She believed that a strong empire was not just built on military might and economic prosperity, but on the intellectual and cultural development of its people. She ruled with a firm hand, her decrees swift and decisive, her punishments harsh but just. She tolerated no dissent, no treachery, no challenge to her authority. But she also listened to her people, their concerns, their needs, their aspirations. She understood that a ruler's true power lay not in fear, but in respect, in the trust of those she governed. And so, Varethia prospered under Valeri's reign, its borders secure, its economy thriving, its people content. The whispers of rebellion faded, replaced by a grudging acceptance of the shadow ruler, the unseen queen who had brought stability and prosperity to the empire. But Valerie, for all her power, for all her achievements, remained a solitary figure, her heart shielded by a wall of ambition, her emotions locked away in the deepest chambers of her soul. She had sacrificed much to reach this point, her innocence, her trust, her capacity for love. And she knew that the price of power, the cost of her victory, was a loneliness that no amount of authority, no amount of adulation could ever truly fill. The empire thrived. Trade routes bustled, the treasury overflowed, and the arts flourished under Valerie's watchful eye. Varethia, once teetering on the brink of chaos, now hummed with a stability it hadn't known in generations. Valerie had achieved what she set out to do. She had secured the Valerius dynasty, albeit in a way no one could have foreseen. Yet, as she strolled through the palace gardens, the scent of roses and jasmine doing little to soothe her troubled soul, a chilling realization settled upon her. She had won, but at what cost? The faces that once greeted her with warmth and affection now bowed with a deference tinged with fear. The laughter that once filled the halls had been replaced by hushed whispers and cautious glances. She was respected, admired even, but never truly loved. She had become a master of the game, but the game had mastered her in turn. The cunning manipulations, the ruthless decisions, the sacrifices she had made, they had hardened her, molded her into a creature of cold ambition, a ruler who valued power above all else. The memory of Murdoch's loyalty, his unwavering belief in her, haunted her dreams. His sacrifice, his final act of redemption, was a constant reminder of the price she had paid for her victory. She had lost a friend, a confidant, a man who had seen the woman beneath the queen, and Caius, her brother, her twin, now a prisoner in his own palace, a puppet dancing to her tune. The guilt gnawed at her, a persistent ache that refused to be silenced. She had saved the empire, yes, but she had also broken her brother, shattered the bond they had once shared, the bond that had been their strength, their solace in a world that had always sought to divide them. She had become the very thing she had sought to protect against, a tyrant, a manipulator, a ruler who sacrificed everything, even love, for the sake of power. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow, a chilling reminder that the path to victory was often paved with the shattered remnants of one's own soul. As she wandered through the silent halls of the palace, the weight of her crown a heavy burden on her head, Valerie wondered if it had all been worth it. Was the stability of the empire, the prosperity of its people, worth the sacrifices she had made, the loneliness she now endured? The answer, elusive and painful, remained hidden in the shadows, a reflection of the queen herself, the woman who ruled from the darkness, the woman who had won the game but lost herself in the process. The years passed, and Valerie's reign continued, a reign of unprecedented stability and prosperity for Varethia. She ruled with an iron fist in a velvet glove, her power absolute, her influence unquestioned. She never took the throne for herself, content to remain in the shadows, the unseen force that guided the empire, the puppet master who controlled the strings of power. Caius remained the emperor, a figurehead, a symbol of the Valerius dynasty, his every move orchestrated by Valerie, his every word a reflection of her will. She had achieved her goals, secured her legacy, but the victory felt hollow, the triumph tainted by a lingering sense of emptiness. The throne room, once a place of vibrant activity, now echoed with a chilling silence, a testament to the isolation she had chosen, the price she had paid for her power. She stood before the throne, its intricate carvings and gleaming jewels a mockery of her own solitude. She reached out, her fingers tracing the cold, hard surface, a shiver running down her spine. This was the symbol of her victory, the culmination of her ambition, the ultimate prize she had sought for so long. And yet it held no warmth, no comfort, no solace. She had become a master of the game, but the game had mastered her in turn. She had conquered her enemies, outmaneuvered her rivals, and secured her power. But in doing so, she had lost a part of herself, a part that she could never truly reclaim. She looked at the throne, its emptiness a reflection of her own soul, and a chilling realization settled upon her. She had won the game, but she had lost herself in the process. She turned away, her footsteps echoing in the silent hall, her shadow stretching long and distorted on the marble floor. As she walked away from the throne she had never truly wanted, she whispered to herself, her voice a haunting echo in the vast emptiness. They made him emperor, but I made him a god. And I will be the one who decides when he falls. The finality of her words hung in the air, a testament to her absolute power, her chilling control, her unwavering determination to shape the destiny of Varethia, no matter the cost. The empire was hers, and she would rule it from the shadows until her dying breath. The game was over, but the reign of Valeri, the Shadow Queen, had just begun.